Dr. Mark Jangizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about how leaders will always be cognitively blind. They will always tend to be blind to the kinds of human cognitive biases that plague us. And the reason that they are, and let me back up. That's one of the things I focus on here at the Science Moment, is the kinds of individual cognitive biases we are all subject to, right? As sort of, I have a cognitive science background, but I also am a physicist, mathematician type, right? Train going by there. And I also focus on the kinds of cognitive biases that occur at the socio-political level. How when you have hundreds of millions or millions of people put together, it ends up with certain kinds of things that happen that emerge from that. In order to understand these things, you have to understand emergent phenomena, evolutionary selection processes. None of this is the stuff that any of us are naturally good at, right? That's the kinds of things I focus on. But because we're all bad at that kind of stuff, and most of us don't end up going into cognitive science and psychology or into physics, where you're good at explaining or understanding your limitations at understanding large-scale complex systems, the average politician, the average leader who's trying to lead, knows none of that, right? And if there were two leaders, one who gets that there's all of these biases that he or she are subject to, versus one that's not aware of that. Now, let's put them side to side. The person that's not aware of that, and let's suppose they're both well-intentioned folks. The person who is blind to these cognitive biases will use flawed arguments in their arguments to the populace. And the populace, also blind to the same human biases, will get whipped up by it because they're often very convincing arguments because they're very intuitive. They're the kinds of intuitions we're all biased to have, right? And so the other well-intentioned potential leader who's saying, look, that's not actually the case. In order to make the case that I'm making, it has to be put like this, right? It has to be put in this way because that would be a cognitive bias to argue the way my competitor's arguing. And everybody's looking and it's like, that doesn't sound as intuitive to me, right? And it isn't intuitive. So such a leader who's immune to the kinds of cognitive biases we are all subject to will not use those biases in their arguments, his or her arguments, and he will thereby not sway the audience who are all subject to those biases as well as the person who is duped by these biases and can use them unintentionally to help sway the populace. This is why leaders and why the populace will always have leaders that are in fact believing what they believe about society with false foundations. And this is a little bit discouraging, and it is discouraging because you're constantly, every generation, we're putting out fires, and these fires are due to fundamental limitations that humans have because of the way we evolved, and there were great ways that we evolved for the kinds of environments we evolved in, and fundamental limitations or constraints due to the physics of how socio-political communities work. These will always be with us. Every generation, we have to fight those kinds of biases that occur and fight other kinds of selection pressures, like that leaders that do not understand these things will be favored. There will be selection pressures will favor them against those who do understand these very biases. And that was your Science Moment. If you haven't gotten a copy of Dr. Tim Barber and my last book, Expressly Human, which is about the origins of emotional expressions. It's not just getting at the emotional expressions that were covered over by masks. It's not just about the foundations of free expression itself. It answers Darwin's question from a couple 150 or so years ago, about why we have emotional expressions at all.